Stand-up comedy is the personification of science.
Thank you. Good night. My name is Harold Bays.
Hello, my name is Dr. Harold Bays, Medical Director and President of the Louisville Metabolic and Atherosclerosis Research Center located in Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome to this series of YouTube videos entitled The Science of Stand-Up. In this series of YouTube videos, we will be exploring the intersection of the science of stand-up with other sciences. In this specific YouTube video, we're going to be talking about comedy techniques. How to manage a heckler and how to close out a comedy routine. This YouTube video is one in a series of YouTube videos where we are exploring the intersection between the science of stand-up and other sciences. At the beginning, we talked about my bona fides as it pertains to my research experience as well as my stand-up comedy experience. And then we talked about the intersection of the science of stand-up with theoretical physics, literary arts, psychology, psychiatry, the social sciences with respect to racism, free speech, cancel culture, and forgiveness. We then talked about the motivational sciences with regard to expectations and objectives. Then we got quite granular in discussing how to prepare for and how to start a stand-up comedy routine. And then we got very scientific and talked about the evolutionary concepts and the neurobiology of laughter, humor, comedy with respect to content. And we defined what is funny. What is funny? And we spent quite a bit of time trying to nail that down. So now, in this particular YouTube video, we're going to be talking about comedy techniques, how to manage a heckler, and how to close out a comedy routine. First of all, with regard to techniques and such, one of the most important aspects of implementation of the techniques is gaining experience. Stand-up comedy is no different than most any other profession. You must get experience. Theory is one thing, but actually carrying it out in the real world, quite something different. Here is a funnel chart that describes the process of drug development. Now again, I'm a clinical trial researcher. I've been an investigator for over 500 clinical trials, and this is what I do. Whenever we're evaluating a potential new chemical entity or a new molecular entity, we start off with over 20,000 candidates, drug candidates per year. And these are discovered both by basic science as well as serendipity. Sometimes things just sort of pop up that are potential drugs and just by accident. Then these potential drug candidates undergo testing, preclinical testing in animals and such. And then if they're proven to be safe and effective, then they move on to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 clinical research trials in humans. And then if it's proven to be safe and effective, then ultimately the drug may be approved. And once approved, can be marketed. So what you can see here, and what is the essential message, is that we start off with tens of thousands of potential candidates, but at the end of the day, only very few make it into a marketable drug. I would say the same applies to stand-up comics. Sure, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of potential stand-up comics entering into the potential workforce every year. And many times these are folks that take the initiative, go to the comedy clubs, do open mic night and such. Or it could be serendipitous. It could be that someone approaches somebody they think could do stand-up comedy. And they say, why don't you give it a try? Why don't you give it a go? See how it works out for you. Based upon this pool of potential stand-up candidates, then after going through open mic night and maybe private jobs and whatever, that gets sort of weeded out. And these comics soon learn that they can't just be doing hack material and such. They got to do their own writing and come up with their own persona and come up with their own routine and their own writing and their own material. And then once they do that, then if they're successful and they continue to work the clubs and other comedy jobs, then ultimately they may become a full-fledged stand-up comic where they can be marketed and be successful. Finally, I think you can take this analogy to bits themselves. When I'm talking about developing the jokes or developing routines, you initiate with a concept, and hopefully from prior YouTube videos, you've gathered the importance of keeping a comedy journal, writing down things as they pop into your head, as you are sleeping, as you are driving, as you are on a plane, as you are doing anything. If it pops in your head, write it down immediately or type it into some sort of a word processing document. Keep it on file, because then when you're developing new routines, you will have them all listed. And don't think you're going to be able to remember them, because many times you won't. So the sooner you write it down, the better. Okay, so you start off with all sorts of concepts and experiences that you've had, and then you start writing them out, and then maybe a few of them make it to actually trying them within the context of a performance in front of a comedy crowd. And then some of those work and some don't. And then at the end of the day, you take these hundreds or thousands of concepts and you may end up with a few very, very strong bits that you can keep within your stand-up comedy routine. One of the things that's sort of frustrating in stand-up comedy, and it's the same with athletes, same with academia, is that this is an article published in 2012, the preference for potential is people love the potential. People always want to know what's the next big thing. And sometimes potential takes priority over actual work, actual hard work. Potential sometimes takes precedent over hard work. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's really unwise for people to do that, but it happens. And it happens, as I said, not just with comics, but with athletes, and it happens in academia. Stand-up comics, as well as athletes and graduate school applicants, having a higher perceived potential are often valued more than comics with established record of success. So I know it's frustrating. You've put in all the hard work, and then some new person comes up, and because of their potential, not because of their accomplishments, they may take priority over you. And it happens. As I said, in academia, how many times well, just think about it. When you went to high school or college, there was probably plenty of people you knew that were just geniuses. And they were amazing. And you said, they're going to really go places. And then as they got to college, they sort of flamed out, and then they ended up doing nothing. They had a lot of potential, but they didn't do the work, so they didn't get it done. Okay, so when we're talking about technique, this is essentially learning your craft. When you develop stand-up comedy techniques, you are learning your craft. And one of the things that I think we've covered quite well is how you can integrate the science of stand-up with other sciences. And I think that's a good place to start if you're trying to develop stand-up comedy techniques. In these series of YouTube videos, we've talked about how stand-up comedy is the personification of science with respect to biochemistry, neuroscience, molecular biology, communications, linguistics, physiology, physics, mathematics, statistics. Some of the early YouTube videos really went into how it is when you look at audiences, that audience responses are just the biological systems, and they adhere to normal Gaussian distributions. And I think that's going to be very important if you're going to be a stand-up comic to know this sort of stuff. Entertainment science, economics, psychology, humanities, social sciences. We have multiple YouTube videos on the social sciences and stand-up. Political science, medical science, and genetics. All of these things have been covered within the context of these YouTube videos regarding the science of stand-up. And one specifically utilized 50 literary devices in developing a stand-up comedy routine. And that was in Stand-Up Definitions Part 2. All right, so as you are starting to develop comedy techniques and such, one of the first things you're going to have to decide is, who are you? Who do you want to be? I mean, you would think that would be a fairly easy question to answer, but it's not. Folks, it took me 3 years. It took me 3 years to figure out who I was and what I wanted to be as a stand-up comic. Now, that's longer than for most. I mean, most people can figure that out in short order, but for whatever reason, it took longer for me. And then you need to decide what kind of comic that you want to be. We covered this extensively in the YouTube video entitled Science of Stand-Up Definitions Part 1. Do you want to be a clean comic, a blue comic? Do you want to do stock material, or do you want to be original? Are there certain types of jokes that you want to gravitate towards? Because remember what the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to become a stand-up comic, a person with a microphone, live audience, delivering the funny. But you can't do that until you decide who you are and who you want to be. Do you want to be known as a woman comic? So let's say you're a woman. I mean, do you want to be known as a woman comic, or do you just want to be known as a stand-up comic that does some women material? Do you want to be a humorist or a prop comic or an impressionist comic? Now, just for clarity, and we've covered this before, maybe you want to be a comedic actor. Well, folks, I mean, that's very different than being a stand-up comic. So if you want to be a comedic actor, I mean, I think having stand-up comedy experience is very helpful, but that's not really what this is about. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but look at all the stand-up comics that have gone on to become successful comedic actors. And I think that's a fair point. But I would say that the contrast is not especially true. I don't know too many comedic actors that have then flipped over and become wildly successful stand-up comics. They're two different things. Finally, there's vaudeville. Do you want to be a vaudevillian? Don't know too many vaudevillian, but maybe it's time for that to come back. What are other types of comics that you may want to be? Well, do you want to be a categorical comic? As I mentioned before, do you want to be known as a woman comic where you do predominantly women material? Or do you want to predominantly do black material? Or do you predominantly want to do country or southern comedy material? Do you want to be a dark comic, an insult comic, a shock comic, avant-garde or experimental comic, hack comic? Hopefully you don't want to be a hack comic. Somebody calls you a hack comic, not a compliment. Not a compliment, folks. Okay? But there are plenty of hack comics out there that get work because they do hack material and people seem to enjoy it. Do you want to be a socio-political comic or a populist comic? Do you want to do physical comedy? How about a road comic? I was a road comic. Not the best of lives, but I did road comedy. Do you want to be a corporate comic or a boat comic? No matter what kind of comic you want to be, there are just certain techniques and principles which are valuable. And I think starting out, I can't think of any technique to master. I can't think of any technique that is more important to master than what Aristotle said 300 BC. And that is, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And that's the observational comedy triad. We went into this in depth in one of the prior YouTube videos on definitions part 1. And I'm just going to skip to the bottom here. You really need to learn the observational comedy triad. And that's where you set up the premise, you do the bit, then you act it out. So if you have a bank of experiences, you've written down, you have a comedy journal, or you have a word processing document where you've written down all these potential bits, and these bits are based upon things that popped in your head or based upon experiences that you've had, then what you can do is take that material and adapt it to the comedy triad. And if you'll just do those things, I think you can start off with reasonable success, because this is a proven technique in order to do stand-up comedy. In addition to the material, you have to work on your presentation. And presentation is more than just being you. You have to develop techniques with your presentation, just like you have to learn techniques with regard to your content. And just to take this to an extreme, almost to absurdity, how people respond to you very much does depend upon the types of cues that you're giving out to the audience. What we call social comedy universal signals. So here's an article that was published in 2015 where it was entitled Robot Comedy Lab, Experimenting with the Social Dynamics of Live Performances. And they had a robot that was programmed with certain universal comedy signals. And apparently the robot was funny. Now, I wasn't there. So I don't know if this robot killed or whatever. I don't know that information because, again, I didn't have first-hand experience, but I think it is quite reasonable that if a robot is programmed with reasonable material and is also programmed with certain presentation techniques, that the robot may do fairly well. What are these techniques that I'm talking about? I'm talking about body orientation, gestures, and gazes. Just those three things alone can make all the difference in a stand-up comedy routine. So the conclusion of this particular article was that these techniques are somewhat irrespective of the presenter. And that's what is intended by the use of the word universal. These are universal techniques of presentation that's really going to help you out when you're doing stand-up comedy routines. Okay, what are other things that influence your presentation, the presentation aspect of your stand-up comedy routine? Well, first is recognition. If people know your face and they know your expression, they've seen you before, or they've seen you on TV, or they've seen you in the clubs or whatever, then they're going to recognize your expressions, and that's going to make things easier on the audience. And it's going to make things easier for you from a presentation standpoint. People don't know who you are, never met you before. As in comedy and as in life, attractiveness matters. The more attractive a person is, the more easily that their facial expressions and their presentation is going to be interpreted. The name of this article here is The Effects of Facial Attractiveness and Familiarity on Facial Expression Recognition. In other words, people are going to understand what your facial expressions mean if they already know your face or if you are attractive. Now, that doesn't mean that stand-up comics have to be attractive. That's ridiculous. I mean, that's obviously not true. No, but the intent here is to say that the ability of people to interpret facial expressions depends upon familiarity of the face, familiarity of the facial expressions, or if that's not possible because people don't know who you are, then attractiveness may matter. Next. So we talked about content. We've talked about presentation. What about tempo? Folks, I think it's important to have variance in tempo. Yes, there are some comics that are sort of deadpan and they have the same affect throughout their entire comedy stand-up comedy routine. That doesn't work for everybody. If that's not your persona, then you need to think about ways to accelerate your tempo, slow down your tempo, increase the volume, decrease the volume. Use these sorts of auditory dynamics, and I think that helps out your routine. And tempo refers to not just the speed of how fast that you talk and such. It also has to do with how fast you get to the joke, right? That's part of tempo. Now, when I started out, I always heard this, get to the joke. Always get to the joke. Just get to the joke. And I did that. And what I found was I didn't spend near enough time on the premise. And I was just trying to get to the joke so fast to avoid silence and such that I never gave the premise a chance, and that would really gut the joke. So if you look on the right over here, this is a quote by Tyron Edwards. Never be so brief as to become obscure. And that took me a while to figure out. So now I've altered this get to the joke paradigm to say get to the joke unless not getting to the joke is part of the joke. So over the years, what I found is that it is important that your premise be every bit as important as the punchline. You need to focus on that premise. You need to make sure that premise has the same sort of pop as the punchline. And sometimes that means not getting to the joke immediately. Sometimes the premise itself can be funny and can bring up imagery and such and can be highly effective in developing a stand-up comedy routine. Down at the bottom here, a prolonged extension of a premise or even silence are comedy techniques that require an advanced understanding of the science of stand-up. And I think that's right. Some of the best comics out there, they can make silence work for them. I mean, how do you make silence funny? Some people can do it. Brian Regan can make silence work, can get applause from bouts of silence. I think if you can do that, if you can make silence funny, then you have entered into the graduate school of the science of stand-up. Okay, so what about some other tips with regard to developing the bit? If you're convinced that a bit is funny, then keep working at it until it becomes a reliable part of your routine. But as you are doing so, remember this: bits are like stocks. Don't fall in love with them. They won't love you back. Now, I know I've been there. I know what you're thinking. You've got this bit. You know it's a killer bit. Everybody else should understand it's a killer bit. But it's just not working out. Folks, sometimes you got to let it go. You may love the bit. You may think it's brilliant. But if you've tried it out several times and it's just not going to work no matter what you do, let it go. You got to let it go. Success in comedy often requires sacrifice of your favorite bits. I understand. It's like a loved one, but you got to let it go. Another thing to think about with regard to technique is employ general speaking techniques. Know these things. Know your topic. Know your craft. Know yourself. We talked about that. Who are you and who do you want to be? Know your audience. We talked about that in the YouTube video of how to start a stand-up comedy routine. Know your environment. Know the venue. Test out your equipment. What are you trying to achieve? What's your goal for this particular routine? And stay within your time. Here are some more general tips. Practice, 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 and then practice more. Videotape yourself. Audio tape yourself. Review it. Get feedback. Be self-critical and gain experience. And then if you do find things you can improve, well, then improve them. It serves no purpose for you to tape yourself and then not change anything. Use the review of your performance to actually implement changes that are going to make you a better stand-up comic. Make anxiety your friend. Before you get on stage, you might be anxious. I did. So I used to pace and pace and pace and all those types of things before I went on stage, and I channeled that energy into the performance. So it increased the energy of the performance. Have confidence through your preparation. Look, if you're not prepared, you're probably not going to be confident, and that's going to be reflected in your performance. But if you are confident because you have prepared, you're going to have a much greater chance of success. Always introduce yourself. Be yourself once you decide who you are. But don't try to sell yourself. That can become problematic, trying to sell yourself. Sell your craft, not yourself. When you're performing, as I mentioned previously, develop the physical techniques that are required that involve things like body control, body language, eye contact, things we already talked about. Develop that sixth sense. If I had to pick the single thing that, well, not the single thing, but one of the most important things I learned doing stand-up comedy that has helped me with speaking is I have developed a sixth sense. Whenever I'm doing a presentation, I can just feel if there's a certain section of the audience that's not paying attention, or maybe things are getting a little dry, or I need to mix it up, and I need to mix it up with regard to volume or tempo, or all those types of things. Maybe even flip the material around a little bit. But you're not going to know when to do these types of things, when to employ these techniques, unless you're paying attention, and unless you've developed this sixth sense about what's going on with the audience, and whether it be the entire audience or certain sections of the audience. As we mentioned, employ dynamics, diversification, both of tempo, volume, the audiologic aspects of your presentation, the visual aspects of your presentation, and maybe even your material. And don't just recite your routine. It's got to come from the heart. People know that you're doing a routine, but it's got to come across as though you're just making it up. You just made it up right as you got on stage. And finally, develop closing techniques, which is what we're going to talk about. So if you've done all these things and you've put in the work, then value your work. If somebody asks you to do a stand-up comedy job, you got to charge money for that. And people may think you're charging too much for just a half hour's work or an hour work or whatever. But remember, the amount of time that you're performing, that has no relationship to the amount of work that was invested. Here's a story that you probably heard before, but I think it's illustrative of what I'm talking about. A woman asked Pablo Picasso, a famous artist, to scribble something on a napkin. She agreed to pay whatever he felt it was worth. Picasso scribbled something on a napkin and said, "That will be $10,000. The woman said, but you did that in 30 seconds. And Picasso responded, "No, it has taken me 40 years to do that." And that's the point, isn't it? It's not that you get on stage and you do 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour, and people say, well, my goodness, you working for $200 an hour or $300 an hour? I mean, that seems excessive, whatever. Folks, your performance is based upon countless hours of work. So value the time that you have invested in your craft. All right, what sort of techniques are required when things go wrong? And I think I'm an expert in this area, because in my experience, whether it be stand-up comedy or whether it be speaking, things going wrong, wow, I have some experience in this area. That's the point. The first thing I would say is, as you're deciding who you want to be, I would say fear the joke. Now, I've talked about how a good place to start would be observational comedy and the comedy triad, comedy techniques. I think that's the best place to start. I don't know too many successful stand-up comics that just do jokes, but some do. And if that's where you're going, then great, just be sure you're good at it. But otherwise, fear the joke. Okay, fear the joke. It's a challenging way to go in stand-up, to just be somebody that stands up there for half hour and 45 minutes and just tells jokes. Okay, so what are some of the more common challenges in stand-up comedy? What are some of the more common things that go wrong? First off, we have to say it, problems with the audience. You do your killer bit, you do your killer routine, and they're not laughing. They're just silent. And you're being humiliated. That's tough. And that is definitely an example of when things go wrong. Small audience. That can be really tough. It's hard to make a bunch of people laugh if they're not a bunch of people. Mismatch, audience mismatch. You've been booked to do a job in front of an audience. It's just not going to work, right? Your comedy isn't going to fit this audience. Another challenge, a source of things that can go wrong would be an inability to remember bits. You just can't remember your bits. You can't remember your bits to put together a coherent routine. Another challenge, stage energy. Folks, you got to be on all the time. It's a performing art. Stand-up comedy is a performance art. So what do you do if you have personal life events, or you're trying to recover from brutal travel, or you're having burnout, or you're having depression that we talked about before is so common among stand-up comics. I mean, how do you maintain stage energy? Another challenge, another issue is timing, stepping on words. What about environmental disasters and technical challenges? And finally, how do you manage a heckler? Well, let's go through this. Let's first talk about the audience. First thing I would say is, folks, just because an audience is quiet or maybe even silent, that doesn't mean they're not enjoying your humor. I've been in audiences before where there'll be somebody doing a stand-up routine or giving a presentation, and I'm looking at the audience and, okay, they're not yelling and screaming and clapping and all those types of things, but they seem to be enjoying themselves. So just because an audience is a bit on the quiet side, folks, we covered this before. Audience responses are consistent with biological systems. They adhere to normal Gaussian distributions. Just by statistical variation, there are going to be some audiences that are colder and some audiences that are hotter. So don't get all wigged out about it. And no matter what the audience responds, you must be confident. If you lose confidence, you're going to lose the crowd. Don't be rattled. Again, all comics have cold crowds. It's just science. Now, let's say you have a pretty good audience, but one of your bits just bombed. You're like, oh no, what am I going to do now? Right? Well, you can acknowledge the total bomb with comedic techniques. One way, and I've certainly done this before, so I'm going through the routine. I have a bit that I've done many times before, and it's always worked, and I throw out that punchline, and it goes nowhere. And I'm sort of taken aback. I'm like, what happened there? But it's happened to all of us. So what I usually do at that point is I just sort of look at the audience knowingly, and I try to convey the message that it was my intent that they not laugh at that joke. Right? That was my intent. In fact, it was my intent to use this punchline as simply a segue to the next bit. And I think you can pull that off. I feel like I've pulled that off before. Where again, you do the bit, it doesn't go quite like you intended, and you just act like it was what you intended. Sometimes you can get away with it. Another thing you can do is, let's say you're doing a joke on xylem and phloem, or I don't know, some sort of botanical joke. I mean, I don't know why you would do that, but I don't know that botany's all that funny, but it doesn't matter. Anything can be funny. You're doing a joke. Let's say you're in Cincinnati, Ohio, and you're doing a bit, and it's about botany, and you hit that punchline, that botanical punchline, and nobody laughs. Okay. Sometimes what you can do is you can act like you're writing yourself a note. I've seen many comics do this before, and I've certainly done it, where you take your hand up and you'll say, never do a botanical joke in Cincinnati, Ohio. Noted. And then you move on. Okay, so you've acknowledged the bomb and you've moved on. You've made that bomb into a comedic advantage by utilizing a comedic technique. And you can move on. Because the point is, be flexible. If it isn't happening, pivot and move on. Get on to the next bit. Don't let it get you rattled. And finally, I'm going to give you advice that I have never taken. All right? Because that's what people who give advice, that's what they usually do. They tell people what they should be doing, and they don't do it themselves. But I still think it's good advice. I just wish I would take it. Develop a short memory. If things don't go well, forget about it. Move on. I can't say that I've done that. When I talked about small audience, I was headlining at Zanies in Chicago. Thursday night, 6 people were in the audience. I can't explain it. The rest of the week was packed. They had to open up another show on Sunday. But on that Thursday, there were only 6 people in the audience. And like an idiot, I just went ahead and did my routine. And of course, it was terrible. What I should have done in retrospect, and this is what I would advise for you, if you are at a big time club, there are only 6 people in the audience, then for your routine, you might just want to go out and sit with the 6 people. That's what I would have done. And as a clinician, as a physician, I would probably ask them about their medical problems and given them free medical advice and joked around with them, and it would have been novel and it would have been great, and I wouldn't have died on stage. So, but I still can't forget it, which is again against my advice to you, which is develop a short memory. An audience mismatch. I remember there was this job they booked all of us for on a Sunday night. They made a new show for this high school audience, and I mean, my material was okay in most places, but really the other comics I was with, it was definitely a comedy mismatch. What about if you're unable to remember the bits that you do to develop your routine? Are there people out there like that? Yeah. People like me. People like me. Look, folks, I don't think having difficulty remembering bits and put them in the correct order, I don't think that's a sign of not being prepared. I don't think it's a sign of not practicing. I don't think it's a sign of lack of intelligence. I mean, go back and look at my bona fides, my research experience. I mean, I've been a principal investigator for over 500 clinical trials and have over 250 publications in peer-reviewed journals. I've helped author 250 publications. And yet I am quite comfortable in telling you I had difficulty remembering bits and how to put them in within the context of a routine. It was hard for me. So how can you do this? How can you overcome this obstacle? Well, it is true that preparing and practicing helps, but you also can develop cues and such, or develop a logical flow and put in your mind that you're telling a story. Or you could even have acronyms. I used to do that. I used to have develop acronyms that would identify each of the bits as I was going through them. Or you could use notes. You could use your comedy stool and have notes. Now, I'm not the only person who ever had to do this. If you look at the clips that I've put in these YouTube videos, you will find the stool has notes that I put on the stool as I was doing stand-up comedy. It's because I couldn't remember the bits. But there are other people that have done this, other people who have used notes. Janine Garofalo, Richard Lewis. And yes, they've been criticized. They say, well, why are they using notes? Why didn't they prepare? Folks, it doesn't have anything to do with preparation. It's just not everybody's wired the same way. And it's not, using notes is not because you didn't prepare. It's not because you didn't practice. It's not because you're not sufficiently intelligent. It's just that people are wired differently. What about problems with stage energy? Look, folks, I get it. We all have things that go on in our lives. But if you're in the performing arts, you got to get it done. You got to get it done. And you've got to learn how to deal with personal stressors. You got to learn to deal with the travel, the burnout, the depression, maybe even your physical and mental health. And it would be great if club owners would be understanding that you're going to have differences in mood depending upon day to day or show to show and whatever. It just doesn't work that way. You have a job to do, and your job is to perform. So if you do have some of these challenges that are altering your stage energy, then just keep these things in mind. First off, you still have to do your time. Don't go over your time. Don't go under your time. And don't think that people are going to say, oh, well, I understand this person's having a tough week or whatever. It's okay if they bail out, or it's okay if they go over. Got to do your time. Another thing is, when in doubt, leave it out. Again, if you're not in the right frame of mind of knowing whether or not you should or should not do a bit, then if you have any doubts, just don't do it. Don't do it. Don't take the chance. And finally, avoid unkind comments about a fellow performer, colleague, country, sections of the country, venue, all these types of things. So even if you're in a crummy mood, it's not going to pay off. Yeah, you might get some laughs out of it, but ultimately it's going to end up hurting you because people don't take kindly to being belittled, right? So short-term gain may result in long-term loss. And if possible, please avoid this, give it up for Alice. Alice is sort of new, and she's an up-and-comer, and she didn't have a particularly good set. And as Alice is leaving the stage, you say, give it up for Alice. She's working really hard for you. Don't do that. Alice already knew she didn't do well. And you don't need to make it worse by saying things like, give it up. Alice is working really hard for you. Okay? All right. Know your audience. Be cautious about trigger topics. And if you want to know what those trigger topics are, my goodness, we have an entire series of YouTube videos talking about the science of stand-up with regard to free speech, racism, forgiveness, and what is funny. So I would encourage you to review that. What about timing errors? Or you've done this amazing premise, you're getting ready for this amazing punchline, and you step on your words. And the joke is dead. It just dies. Well, what do you do then? I mean, you could acknowledge it. If it's really blatant, I've always found that if there's really a blatant problem or a blatant error, just acknowledge it, and move on. I mean, you can't do that too many times, but if you're only doing it once per routine, I mean, I think that's okay. You can say things like, wow, sort of messed that one up, didn't I? Or something. But I think it's better to acknowledge it than to just try to move on as though nothing happened. And then once you acknowledge it, just quickly reconstruct the fourth wall. You remember the fourth wall, where you have 3 walls behind you, and then there's that wall between you and the audience. And we talked about how it is that when the audience knows that you're giving a routine, they get it. But they're pretending in their mind as though you're just talking to them. Like this is the first time you've ever come up with this material. It was right there at that show. Now, as I said, practically, they know it's a routine. But they want to believe that this is the first time you've come up with this stuff, right? So let them believe that and get back to the fourth wall and go on with your routine. Acknowledge the problem, but then quickly move on. So what about when things go wrong from a technical standpoint? Things like environmental disasters and other technical challenges. Give you some examples. What about if the mic goes out? You got no sound. I was introduced by an opener who had just, prior to me going on stage, had accused me of being a populist comic. Don't know what he meant then, don't know what he meant now. But it was not meant as a compliment. And I said, look, I do original material, and I'm not blue, and the audience seems to like it. Why are you judging me? I don't get it. I mean, I understand maybe there's some jealousy involved here because I seem to be moving up and this person wasn't, but still don't get it. So he hands me the mic as he introduces me, and the mic is dead. Doesn't work. Now, I'm not saying he did anything to it. I don't think he did. But still, here I'm mad because somebody's just been critical of me for being original. And now I'm faced with the fact that I have no audio. I have no mic. So what I did was I set the mic down on the floor, and I just unleashed on the audience in this rant, this diatribe, things that upset me and such, all these populist things that upset me. Best set I ever had. No mic, right there in the audience, talking with them. Best set I ever had. Opener was not happy. What if the lights go out? What are you going to do then? I mean, you just have to ad-lib and do the best you can. Surrounding weather, I think you have to acknowledge that. And as I'm going to mention here in just a few minutes, have some material ready in case there is inclement weather. That you have some stock material ready to go in order to respond to this sort of situation. What about surrounding sounds? Construction. If you're going to do comedy outside of clubs, you're going to be at venues where there's going to be construction going on. Makes it very tough. What if there's an event going on next door, in the meeting room next to yours? What are you going to do? Need to be prepared. Here's a big one. If you're doing a comedy show at a hotel, inevitably, the people behind the curtain, they're going to be cleaning up dishes, aren't they? You stand-up comics know what I'm talking about. They're going to be cleaning up dishes. And when they clean dishes, what I mean by that is they're going to be throwing dishes and smashing them for no apparent reason during your routine, which is very distracting. But you got to be prepared. And then you have the audiovisual people. We've talked about this before in a prior YouTube video. Sometimes the AV people, they want to be part of the show. And that can be very challenging. Or they just think the stage is their domain. And again, for no particular reason, they may just get up and start walking around the stage while you're performing, which is extraordinarily distracting, but you need to learn how to deal with it. You need to be ready. So what can you do? Well, this is similar to other advice I've given in the past. Be prepared. Have stock material. Or if you're just really good at improvisation, be ready to give on-the-fly commentary. Be ready. My advice would be to go through each one of these and develop stock material ready to go in case any of these things happen. But if you're just not going to do that, and you have confidence in yourself, at least be ready to give on-the-fly commentary. Yet again, even when all these things go bad, do your time. Now, obviously, if the lights go out and such, I mean, that's a little bit extreme. But avoid the excuses. I can't tell you how many times I've seen stand-ups or presenter that when things go wrong, the first inclination is to make excuses. Well, the reason things didn't go well is because of all these problems. Folks, you're the professional. You're the one that's supposed to deal with it. You're the one that's supposed to make it work. And if you can make it work because you're prepared, then whoever has hired you is going to think a lot more of you than if you just sort of run off the stage and start making a bunch of excuses. No excuses in comedy. As I said, acknowledging the problem is most often the best thing to do. Acknowledge this environmental disaster or technical challenges. If people are smashing dishes behind you while you're trying to do your routine, be ready to say something with your stock material, but I think you have to acknowledge it. And then there may be times where you need to embrace immortality via obliteration of the fourth wall. Now, what do I mean by that? As before, in a stage, you got three walls behind you, and you have the fourth wall, which is that wall between you and the audience. And as you are doing your routine, there's this imaginary fourth wall, even though you're doing a routine where you're talking to the audience. It's like a Shakespearean play, right? But if things become so crazy, sometimes having the audience as an active participant in dealing with this disaster can be very funny. And if you do it right, then you can embrace immortality via obliteration of the fourth wall. Now you might say to yourself, well, yeah, but if I develop this stock material to deal with these tragedies, these challenges and such, won't the audience see through that? Look, folks, it's like I talked to you before. There's something called cognitive dissonance where you can have two opposing thoughts at the same time. And that, if you think about it, that's what the audience is doing when they're witnessing your performance. As you are performing, intrinsically they know you're doing a routine. They know you didn't just make this up right before you walked on stage. They know this. But at the same time, they've convinced themselves that this in fact is the first time. That's what they want to believe. So they have this cognitive dissonance. And that same sort of cognitive dissonance on the part of the audience applies if you have stock material to deal with technological or environmental disasters during your routine. So don't worry about it. Just prepare, be ready, and be funny. And then there's the heckler, or sometimes called an audience troll. Who is a heckler? A heckler is a person who interrupts a performer or public speaker, often with disruptive or abusive intent. Now, I think most stand-up comics would agree that That's not the only definition of a heckler, and we're going to get into that. Where did the term heckler originate? So hopefully you've gathered that throughout this series of YouTube videos, I mean, if a person were an established stand-up comic, I think any of these established stand-up comics would agree they didn't know all this stuff. And maybe this is something that not every stand-up comic knows. What is the origin of the word heckler? The term heckler originated in Scotland in the 19th century, where hecklers, okay, hecklers were textile or weave workers who combed flax plant stems into linen. And they were well known to interrupt and debate the reading of the day's news at the heckling factory. So these were apparently a very surly group, because nothing says surly and intimidation quite like somebody who's a weave worker. Quite like somebody whose occupation is combing flax plant stems into linen. These are folks to be feared. Okay, so anyway, they had this reputation, and since then, people who interrupt performances and such are called hecklers. But there are different types of hecklers, and let's make sure we nail this down, because there's different ways to deal with different types of hecklers. So what are the different types of hecklers, at least from a stand-up comedy perspective? First, there's the active heckler. And examples would be the individual who just blurts out nonsensical input or unexpected shouts. It's just, again, nonsensical or whatever. And many times these individuals are intoxicated. Then there's the critic. Critic who sits back and says, "You're not funny." Okay? And that can be tough, especially if you're not being funny. And just for disclosure, I ended up being okay with dealing with hecklers. I certainly was not the best. I would say I developed medium skills in dealing with hecklers. But when I first started, I was the worst. I think I could go down in the annals of stand-up comedy history as being the worst with hecklers. I was terrible. I was at a show somewhere in Indiana, and all the other comics, they're off to the side watching me do my routine, and it is not going well. And this guy in the audience yells out, "You're not funny." And I'd been doing comedy for about 4 years by that time, and I looked at the guy, and my best retort of the night was to say, "Yeah, well, screw you, pal." That was my handling technique of the heckler. And of course, the audience just looked at me like I was from Mars, and the stand-up comedy buddies of mine were just dying. They thought that was the funniest thing that they have ever heard, because it was so lame. All right, so yet again, I think a good plan would be to develop techniques to deal with hecklers and not try to do it on the fly. We're going to be talking about that. Then you have the challenger or corrector, where you have people in the audience, you're setting up a premise and they want to correct your premise. And you just want to look at them and say, "Well, thank you, Mr. Helper. Thank you for busting up my premise, for which now I have no available punchline. Thank you very much." And then you have the person that just interrupts the show relentlessly, and inevitably, at the end of the night, at the end of the show, they will come up to the comic who they heckled, and they will say, "Man, you and I need to go on the road, because I really helped your show." This is how oblivious that some people are. They will be heckling, you will be crushing them, they will look like an idiot, and at the end of the show, they're fine with that. They honestly think they helped your show. They don't see that they were a problem. And just different ways of thinking, I guess. And then there is the passive heckler. Now, this didn't bother me as much as it bothers others, but there are some comics that this just drives them crazy. There will be people who sit in the front row who are not paying a bit of attention to the performance. They're not paying a bit of attention to you. And They're engaged in activities like looking at their cell phone or sending text messages or yawning or just eating and drinking and not laughing or smiling or having any participation in the show. And for some stand-up comics, that's very distracting. All right, so what are you going to do? You're doing your routine, things are going well, but now you've encountered a heckler. What do? How do you manage the situation? One of the things you can do is you just ignore it. You can just say, okay, this is going to be a one-time thing, and if I ignore it, then this person will shut up and not say anything anymore throughout the rest of my routine, and just going to let it go. And in order for you to be able to do that, you're going to have to stay calm. And you're going to have to confirm whether it's a problem. Okay? Confirm whether it's a problem. And if somebody just blurts out something one time and you ignore it, maybe it's not a problem. I had a buddy of mine. He had just come off the road for several weeks, and now he's in the safe confines there of the club. And as he's doing his routine, somebody just laughed out of turn. That's it. The person wasn't mean. They weren't being confrontive. They weren't doing anything other than laughing when they shouldn't have been laughing. My buddy just ripped into the guy, just tore him to shreds. When he got off stage, I said, "What is going on with you? What happened?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, I've been on the road." And I said, "Well, you're not on the road now. You're safe. It's okay. Okay, you can bring it down a few notches there, pal. Okay." So again, you can just ignore the heckler, be calm, and before you resort to extremes, confirm that it's a problem. So if it is a problem, here are things to do. First, quickly react and move on. Don't dwell on it. Unless dealing with hecklers is part of your routine, which there's some comics that's what they do. Dealing with hecklers they're better at dealing with hecklers than they are with their routines. So that's part of what they do, and that's fine. But if you're not that way, react to the heckler with the techniques you have learned and move on. Be prepared. Have heckler lines. Now, what are the types of lines that you can use? You can do stock material that everybody does, and that's fine. People laugh at it. I mean, I would never do these, but you can certainly do these. One is to say, do I come to McDonald's and tell you how to do your job? So somebody heckles you, and to belittle them, you say, do I come to McDonald's and tell you how to do your job? It works. People think it's funny, and then maybe the person will be quiet. I mean, I guess one of the problems I have here is, what's wrong with working at McDonald's? I mean, I started off in the food industry and such, and I don't know. That's just not a way I would approach it, but again, lots of people use this line. Or here's another one. I remember when I had my first beer. Again, just some sort of subtle cut or whatever that you can just simply say and move on. Quickly react and move on. And then there's tons of jokes that you can do about the circumstances of the audience member conception. And, I didn't do blue material, so not anything that I would ever do, but if you do blue material anyway, you can just go on the internet, you can find probably 50 retorts where you're just crushing somebody in the bluest of manners regarding the circumstances of their conception. That's the direction you want to go. But overall, unless dealing with a heckler is something that's part of your routine, something that you routinely do, minimize the problem. Just like in life, just like in work, minimize the problem. And then the other thing is acknowledge the obvious, because acknowledging the heckler sometimes relieves the tension. If a person is heckling not just once, but multiple times, you got to acknowledge it, because it gets to be where if you're just ignoring it, it becomes distracting. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times the audience wants to see you engage the heckler because they want to know what you're made of. They want to know your stuff. But as you're doing this, remember this. Who is following you? If you're an opener or if you're a middle, you better know who's following you. Because if they're not adept at dealing with hecklers, they're not going to be very happy if you go in this long interactive session with a heckler and get people all chatty. So you need to be very careful, because the show isn't just about you. It's not just about your survival and what's fun for you. It's It's about the show. So what are specific things you can do? Well, if the person is just not going to be quiet despite being ignored, then listen to them. And one of the most effective ways to really make interaction with a heckler funny is to repeat exactly what they said. So whatever they blurt out, just repeat it. Now there's a bunch of different reasons to do this. Number one, the audience. If you've otherwise done well and you're a nice person, or you appear to be a nice person on stage, the audience is on your side. You've already got the advantage. Secondly, you have the microphone. So that's another major advantage. Thirdly, you can pick and choose like what it is that you're going to repeat. That's another advantage. Also, if you repeat what the person just said, then that gives you time to think about your retort and how you're going to handle it. The bottom line is this, particularly if somebody just blurts out some nonsense, if you just simply repeat the nonsensical thing that the person said, then that's going to be funny. And the audience is going to acknowledge that it's funny, right? So again, and finally I should say this, many times if a heckler's just saying things on the stage and you give some amazing retort, if they've never heard what it is that the heckler said, your retort doesn't mean anything. So in order for your retort or your reply or your management to be effective, the audience has got to know what it is that the heckler said. So I can't emphasize this enough. Repeat what it is that the heckler said. This is even with speaking engagements. How many times have you been to a presentation? Someone in the audience will ask a question. You didn't hear it. And then the speaker gets up and goes into this long, detailed answer. And you're like, but I don't even know what the question was. It's the same principle. All right?
How many people out here been to jail before? Yeah. Back off! Do you realize if you're put in jail, an attorney will represent you for $1,000. What the hell was that? If you're put in jail, like Spike Jones up here. What the hell's going on? You know. Spike Jones fans out here. I like that. How many audience would know who Spike Jones is? How many? I love you people. Oh, who is he, guys? She sang with Randy Travis. I think he does. They did a duet. Wow. Forever and ever, hey, man. An attorney. We lost total control, huh? I had this neatly planned act tonight and it's completely out of control here. An attorney.
Next thing to do is to get the heckler on your side. If you can get the heckler on your side, then maybe they'll calm down and they'll be quiet. If that isn't going to happen, and the person's still challenging you, or they still think that they're being funny, then get the audience on your side, right? Get the audience on your side to see if peer pressure will shut the person down. So again, acknowledge the situation, repeat what the heckler said, try to manage it on your own, but at some point, you may need to employ the audience. And here, you're going to ask the audience their input. And you have to be very strategic about this. What the audience is not want to do, what the audience is not going to want to do, they don't want to get involved actively. But they don't mind getting involved passively. So what does that mean? So what you do is you say, okay, you seem to think that you're the show tonight. And I'm thinking that these people came to hear the stand-up comics. I'm thinking that's why they came here and paid the money, was to see me, not you. But I could be wrong on that. So let's take a poll of the audience. By applause and by raising your hand, either one, how many people came to hear this person? And you point at the heckler. Now look what I did there. I didn't say how many people came here to see me, either by raising of the hands or applauding? Because what if they don't like me? Or what if they don't want to get involved? Well, then they're not clapping or they're not raising their hand. But because you're requiring that they engage in some sort of active behavior in order to support the heckler, who probably don't want to support anyway, chances are you're going to win. Chances are they're not going to clap, and the chances are they're not going to raise their hand, right? So be strategic about how it is that you poll the audience. And if you say, how many people by applause came to hear this person, chances are they're not going to clap. Because A, they didn't come here to see that person, but B, it would have otherwise required them to be active. And by being passive, which is where they want to be anyway, you can make your point and move on. Here are things that I would advise you not do if dealing with a heckler is a problem. Do not assume the audience knows what sort of day or week or month you've had. So as I said before, if somebody just laughs out of turn and makes some sort of comment that otherwise could have been ignored, don't just blast them out of the water and then say, well, yeah, I had a bad day. So the last thing I want to hear is this heckler, and so I just laid into him. Audience doesn't care about you. They paid their money. They want to see a performance. Do not cede the stage or microphone. Please don't do that. I've seen that before. Where a stand-up comic will say, you think this is easy? Why don't you get up here and tell some jokes? That never ends well. Never ends well. Sounds neat, sounds interesting, sounds innovative, but it's not. People who've tried it, doesn't work, don't do it. Don't be the comedy police. If the heckler won't stop, just simply ask the club to sort it out. Have somebody come up and, if necessary, remove the person from the audience. Do not let the heckler become the entire show, particularly if you have acts that are following you. That will totally disrupt the mindset of the room. Don't do it. Here, you don't want to embrace immortality via obliteration of the fourth wall. I'm talking about if it's going to be confrontational. Yes, it'll be remembered if you become confrontational with the heckler, and particularly if there's physical violence involved, but I would advise against that. Do not become confrontational. Instead, keep it playful. If it doesn't work out, ask the club to handle it. I guess what I'm trying to say is this. Avoid the nuclear option. Keep your emotions in check. Be safe. The risk for violence is not worth it. Talk to other comics. They can tell you not only have they been assaulted, but maybe when they leave the club, their car's been vandalized or whatever. You don't need that in your life. Let the club handle it. And then finally, there's some comics that put up these signs that say no heckling. And some do it because they genuinely don't want heckling. And it's just something they don't want to deal with. I don't know you should be putting up a sign like that, because that just seems like you're inviting people to heckle. But then there's other people that put out no heckling signs because they're encouraging people. They're warning people that if they start heckling, they should be prepared to experience the worst. And these are comics that just relish the moment to just annihilate somebody for being a heckler. And that's a choice you can make if that's the route you want to go. I mean, I guess the only problem there is if you're looking towards a long-term future, I don't know too many movie opportunities for people who are really good at managing hecklers, right? Usually comics that go on to be successful in getting on the late night talk shows or movies and that sort of thing, these are people who have developed skills to do routines, and not somebody that can simply know how to outmaneuver a heckler. All right. So what are some of the more important aspects as to who can best manage a heckler, or challenges that occur, or problems that arise during a stand-up comedy routine? Well, it should be no surprise. It's experience. It's having been there. It's having done that. It's having gone home and said, oh man, I could have done this different. I will do it different next time. These types of things. The experience. There is no substitute for experience. Here's an article that was published in 2020. Comedians, trait level, and stage personalities. evidence for goal-directed personality adaptation. Quote, professionals expressed the appropriate onstage persona and were better able to regulate their personality to conform to situational requirements compared to amateurs. So professionals were better than amateurs in adaptation. I mean, is that a surprise to anyone? This is consistent with research showing that individuals regulate their personality to conform to situational and goal requirements, and adds to the finding that successful comedians demonstrate enhanced adaptability compared with amateurs. In other words, because professionals have been through it before, they're better equipped to deal with it again. Need the experience. All right, so what about the closing bit? So you've went through the science of stand-up education through these YouTube videos. You understand the science. You've watched the section that has to do with preparation in the beginning. You've watched the section that has to do with what is funny. And now we've just talked about what to do if unexpected events arise, or unanticipated events arise, or unanticipated challenges arise, and problems, and whatever. We've just discussed those things. And now it's time to close. How do you close your routine? What should your closing bit be? Well, it depends. Because the need for a killer closing bit may depend upon the status of the comic. So let's say you're an established comic. People know that you're really good. Well, how often have you seen a stand-up comic who's really, really good close with sort of an average bit? It was okay, but it didn't get a massive applause or whatever. I mean, ultimately, the comic did get a standing ovation or whatever, but it wasn't because of a killer last bit. It was because of the body of the entire work. That's the difference between an established comic and an up-and-coming comic. Because most up-and-coming comics want to impress the club owner. And so, yeah, they want a closing bit. They want a bit that when they finish, that people are really clapping, and that's the last image that the club owner has about their routine, that people are very, very appreciative of the stand-up comedy routine. And as before, there are certain aspects of these YouTube videos where I try to educate even the most experienced stand-up comic on things maybe they didn't know. Here's maybe something that not everybody knows. Are you aware that many times applause from the audience has nothing to do with the bit, has nothing to do with comedy? It's all cued. It's all cued. It's people responding to cued signaling. For example, structural norms. Whenever you introduce somebody, you say, here, welcome to the stage tonight, whoever. People start clapping. Well, folks, there wasn't anything funny about that, but the audience understands that when somebody's introduced, they are being cued, because it's a structural norm, they are being cued to applause. And then when the next comic gets up on the stage, what's one of the first things the new comic does? Well, the new comic turns around to the person just left the stage and says, hey, give it up for John Smith here. He did a fabulous job. Give it up. Give a big round of applause to this person. So people start clapping again. Well, they're not clapping because anything was funny about acknowledging this person, but acknowledging the person is a cue for applause. Other cues for the applause include polling. When I've tried to warm up the crowd, I've certainly used that technique where I've done polls of the audience. I'll say, how many people out here think the government takes way too many taxes out of their paycheck every month? People start applauding or whatever. I'm warming up the crowd. I'm giving them cues to applaud. And finally, closing. No matter how horrible you do as a comic, or no matter how well you do, when you get done and you say, thank you, good night, my name is, in my case, Harold Bays, people start clapping because that's structural norm. Same thing with content. There's certain content that you can do that is going to cue applause. Simple statements of truth. Sometimes if you just give a simple, truthful statement, that can result in applause from the audience. Contrast. If you can develop a premise or a setup or whatever that is kind of this us versus them, and you make it into some sort of a statement, people will applaud that because they're like, yeah, rage against the machine, stick it to the man, yeah, and they'll start applauding. That's a cue. It isn't because it was funny, it's because people are being cued. And it's the same thing with agreement. How many times have you set up a joke or done a premise where in the premise it's something that everybody agrees upon, and you make a statement for which everybody agrees and they start clapping? Well, they're not clapping because it's funny or they approve of your performance. They're clapping because they agree with the statement that you made. They're being cued. Well, what are examples of spontaneous applause? Well, here, yes, if you do a really good bit, closing or not, and people are very appreciative of that, then they will spontaneously applaud. But also there's other examples, things like an effective use of silence. Sometimes, if you're really good, you can make silence elicit applause. It's very challenging to do. It's the advanced science of stand-up. But if you can do that, if you can create silence and have people applaud silence, then you know that you've entered into the graduate program of the science of stand-up. And then there's the delayed understanding. I think we've all experienced that, where you do a bit and it's subtle. Initially, people didn't laugh until they got the joke. And then there's this wave of laughter, this wave of spontaneous laughter. And then people realize that they didn't get the joke, but now they got the joke, and now they're applauding because they're congratulating themselves on getting the joke, and they're congratulating you because you had a joke that they initially didn't understand, but now they do. So very complex, but that can result in spontaneous applause. So this has been another in a series of YouTube videos regarding the science of stand-up. We have discussed techniques, how to manage a heckler, and how to close out a comedy routine. Please click on the subscribe button to add this to your YouTube subscriptions. Click on the notification button so you can be notified of subsequent new content. Click on the like button if you liked this YouTube video. Click on the share button if you would like to share this via email, Twitter, Facebook. And as with the other YouTube videos in the science of stand-up, I would like for you to answer some of these questions. Number one, how much is the success of a stand-up comic due to innate talent versus learning the techniques of the craft? Number two, if the priority is the quality of the entire show, how are hecklers best managed? Number three, which is more enjoyable to you, a comedy performance that is flawless or a comedy show that encounters unexpected disasters like equipment failures, environmental challenges, and the heckler? So thank you again. My name is Dr. Harold Bays, Medical Director and President of the Louisville Metabolic and Atherosclerosis Research Center, and you have been watching yet another YouTube video on the science of stand-up.